The Viking period we can see is, it's characterized by an enormous interest in the world.
When you think of Vikings, epic battles and fearless warriors come to mind. But life wasn't all about swinging swords and sailing ships. These guys had some nasty habits that would make you raise an eyebrow. From using urine to start fires to unknowingly unleashing armies of rats and mice wherever they traveled. Here are some of the filthy things Vikings did that was not shown on TV. They abandoned the weak. Life among the Vikings was brutal, and they had little patience for weakness. In their world, strength meant survival, and anything less was a threat to the entire clan. If a child was born weak or sick, or even if the firstborn was a girl, they didn't always get a second chance. Children who weren't worth keeping were left to die from exposure. Many believed it was an act of kindness to spare them the struggles they would face in such a tough world. It wasn't just babies who met this fate. Wounded warriors had it just as rough. When warriors returned from battle with deep wounds, there wasn't much time for pity. It fell to the women who learned to deal with these wounds firsthand. They had a special way to tell if a warrior could be saved. The injured were given a broth brewed from onions, leeks, and herbs. After the warrior drank, the women would lean in close, sniffing the wound for the scent of the broth. If they caught a whiff, it was a sign the cut ran too deep. There wasn't much hope left. Those men would be left to face their fate alone. The healers only focused on those they could actually save. It was a world that didn't wait for the weak to catch up. You had to be tough, or you didn't make it at all. But there were other darker ways they displayed their strength, ways that involved more than just abandoning the injured or the sick. Sometimes it meant seeking out something entirely different. They targeted monks for a darker purpose. The Vikings didn't just raid for treasure, they had other goals in mind, and it was far darker than most tales tell. You have probably heard stories of Viking warriors storming through monasteries, looting along the coasts of Ireland, Britain, and France. But there was something else they were after, and it wasn't gold or silver. These raiders had their eyes on a different prize: people. Viking slave trading was a massive business. They took it to a whole new level, setting up bustling slave markets in places like Dublin and Limerick. These cities were built for the slave trade, staying busy for hundreds of years as Viking raiders kept capturing people. Monasteries became prime targets, not because the Vikings hated the faith or sought out holy treasures, but because monks often knew how to read and write. That skill made these men valuable, especially in places far from their homeland. There was a huge demand for slaves, particularly in the Middle East and Byzantium. And not just any slaves, eunuchs were especially prized. Once captured, many literate monks were shipped off to Venice, where they were castrated before being sold into a new life. Some ended up as teachers, others guarded harems, worked in palaces, or even served in government roles. For the Vikings, these raids were like digging up a different kind of treasure, one that didn't glitter but brought in plenty of wealth. Each captured monk or skilled person added to the massive network that stretched across the Mediterranean, fueling the thriving slave trade. It's hard to look at all that raiding and not see just how deep their plans really went. But as cold as the slave trade was, not every Viking confrontation came down to capturing or selling people. Sometimes it was about settling scores. Hom Gang Justice wasn't quite what you would expect during the times of the Vikings. The rules weren't always clear-cut, and not all crimes were equal. Oddly enough, insulting someone from a higher social class was a big deal, but killing someone? Well, that didn't always break the law. If a person was murdered, it wasn't uncommon for the victim's family to seek revenge by killing the murderer themselves. This kind of justice often led to endless blood feuds that lasted for years. But there was another way to settle scores, something called a Hom Gang. Now, a Hom Gang wasn't a rowdy gang or anything like that. It was a duel, often with deadly stakes, where one person challenged another who had wronged them. Once challenged, the duel had to take place within a week. Sometimes a friend or family member could even step in to fight in place of the person who was called out. Before the fight began, the challenger would read the rules, which changed depending on where you were. The rules laid out everything: what weapons were allowed, how many shields each fighter could use, who got the first swing, and what marked the winner. In some cases, there were set limits, like the number of strikes or hits. But often, the duel only ended when one fighter was too hurt to continue, or worse, dead. Backing down wasn't an option. If the person challenged didn't show up, it was as good as admitting guilt. And if the crime was serious, anyone could take action, no matter their social status. It meant even a slave could legally kill a clan leader who failed to appear for a duel with no consequences. The system didn't just demand courage, it made sure there was a price to pay for cowardice. But the Vikings had more than just harsh laws and bloody duels up their sleeves. They had other ways of standing out from the crowd, some of which might surprise you. Viking men filed their teeth. Viking life was full of harsh customs, but one practice stands out as truly strange and painful. Archaeologists have discovered that some Viking men would file their teeth. The evidence shows up in remains found in places like Sweden, Denmark, and even England, dating back to the 10th century. These men had horizontal lines carved into their front teeth, and sometimes even on their side teeth and canines. After the filing, they would dye the marks, often using red to make the patterns stand out. It must have been excruciating, but why did they do it? Nobody knows exactly where this custom came from. It's a mystery, though there are clues that the practice may have come from places like West Africa or the Americas. Vikings did travel far and wide, so it's possible they saw something similar during their explorations. But even with this theory, the reason behind the painful tooth carving still isn't clear. One idea is that it was done for looks. Some of the teeth found in England were filed so carefully that it was clear a skilled person had done the work, not the Vikings themselves. Some also suggest that the teeth filing might have marked someone as a great warrior. The cuts and color might have been a badge of honor, showing the world just how tough they were. Another belief is that the Vikings did it to intimidate. Imagine facing a wild-looking fighter with strange marks on his teeth, dyed red like blood. To Christian monks and villagers, already terrified by these fierce raiders, those filed teeth would have added an extra layer of fear. The Vikings had their reasons for these painful rituals, even if we can only guess at them today. They seemed to find strength in the strangest of places, and what they did next in honor of their fallen was sacrificing slaves. Imagine living in a world where you are not even considered a person. You are a possession, bought and sold like livestock. Your body, your labor, your very life all belong to someone else. That's the harsh reality of being a slave in Viking society. The social ladder had three main rungs: the noblemen at the top, freemen in the middle, and thralls at the bottom. Thralls were slaves, treated as property and forced to obey their masters. If someone was born to enslaved parents, they were automatically a thrall too. Others ended up in this life because they were captured in battle or couldn't pay off their debts. The buying and selling of slaves wasn't just common. It was a big part of the economy, with about 10% of the population living as thralls. Even small households had a few slaves, while wealthier families owned dozens. Conditions for thralls were rough, no matter who owned them. They did the toughest jobs, facing hard labor day after day. Worse still, many were abused in other ways, often used by their masters as they pleased. Thrall graves in Scandinavia were studied, and researchers found grim evidence about how most slaves died. It was rare for them to pass away peacefully. In fact, many thralls were sacrificed when their masters died. An account from an Arab explorer named Ibn Fadlan describes such a ritual. He told of a slave girl who was forced to lie beside her dead master while 6 men entered a tent and had their way with her. Then she was held down by 4 men as an older woman, known as the Angel of Death, wrapped a rope around her neck. With a dagger in hand, the woman stabbed the girl between the ribs repeatedly, while the others tightened the rope until her life was gone. The lives of thralls were no doubt shaped by cruelty and suffering, but when it came to power in the household, things could still shift in surprising ways. Viking women and divorce. In a time when women's rights barely existed elsewhere, life for Viking women was a bit different. They didn't just stay at home. They had a surprising amount of freedom. Owning land and property was an option, and they weren't limited to traditional roles. They could run businesses, serve as religious leaders, or even take up weapons as generals. But it didn't end there. When it came to marriage, women had more control than you might think. If they were unhappy, they could ask for a divorce, and they had the law on their side. There were 3 main reasons a woman could end her marriage: if her husband was violent, if their sex life was disappointing, or if he exposed himself indecently. Yet even if none of these things happened, she could still choose to leave him. To make it official, she would call in witnesses, often to their home or even the marriage bed itself, and announce in front of them that she was divorcing her husband. When she did, she could take back her dowry, along with any inheritances she had gained during their time together. However, even in a place where women had more freedom, cheating wasn't taken lightly. Affairs happened, but they weren't exactly approved of. Over time, infidelity became a serious issue for both men and women. If someone got caught having an affair, it wasn't just a scandal. The cheated partner had the right to seek deadly revenge. That's right, if a man found his wife in bed with another, or if a wife found her husband doing the same, they could kill both the cheating partner and the lover. While it's clear that women had some power in relationships, yet there were times when even marriage customs seemed like the least intense thing around. Some rituals, especially those involving animals, took a darker turn. The Hovig. During the time of the Vikings, there was a harsh and bloody tradition that drew crowds together. It wasn't a contest between men, but between powerful stallions, locked in a battle called the Hovig. This brutal event was a big part of life in the old days, especially in places like Iceland during the Viking Age. The tradition likely started in Norway and then spread to nearby lands. It wasn't just about watching animals fight. It had a purpose. People used these matches to find the strongest horses for breeding. The battles took place inside a fenced ring. This ensured that the stallions couldn't back away like they might in the wild. In the middle of it all was a mare, chosen for her scent because she was in heat. She was tied up, either inside the ring or nearby, to stir up the stallions and make them fight for her. If the horses didn't show enough interest in fighting, people would whip or startle them to get them riled up. Once the battle began, it could go on for a long time, sometimes just 15 minutes, but other times dragging on for over 3 hours. The fights were divided into rounds, giving a brief pause between all the biting, kicking, and thrashing. It was a relentless scene, with the match usually ending when one horse was too badly hurt to go on or didn't survive. These bloody competitions weren't just about finding the toughest stallion. They also showed the crowd the strength and spirit of the animals. And as hard as it was to watch, the people saw it as a test of nature's way, where only the fittest survived. But this wasn't the only time they embraced such brutality. Some rituals were even darker, where the stakes were much higher and the bloodshed went far beyond just animals. Subscriber's pick. Before we continue with the rest of the video, let's take a good look at this picture. On the left, we have got a serious-looking guy with bright blue eyes and face paint, looking like he just stepped out of an epic battle. He has got that wild hair and beard, as if he hasn't seen a comb in weeks. And then on the right, there is a raging warrior in a horned helmet, roaring like someone just stole his meal. Below him, a woman seems terrified, which kind of makes you wonder what's really going on here. Filthy things that Vikings did that was not shown on TV seems like the perfect way to sum this up. It makes you wonder, how much do we really know about the Vikings? Sure, TV gives us the epic battles and brooding heroes, but what about the dirty, gritty realities? The things that wouldn't get past network censors? Like, what did they really do during those long winters? And how much worse would it have been if they had Instagram back then? There is definitely a lot more to the story than the epic battles and wild celebrations you see on TV. So, what's your take? Would you survive a day in the life of a real Viking? Or would the filthy side of things send you running back to modern times? Share your thoughts in the comments section. Blood Eagle. In a world where life was already harsh and dangerous, there was a form of punishment so dreadful it almost seemed like a legend. Some say it was one of the most painful ways a person could ever be put to death. It was called the Blood Eagle, and just hearing about it might make your skin crawl. The victim, still alive, was placed face down while their ribs were cut away from the spine. But the horror didn't end there. Salt was poured into the open wounds, stinging and burning like fire. As if that wasn't enough, the lungs were pulled out through the back and spread over the ribs to look like wings. It was gruesome, to say the least. Stories of the Blood Eagle only appear a couple of times in Old Norse tales, but they were always about important people, like a royal or someone of high status. It was usually carried out by someone seeking revenge, like a son avenging his father's murder. That makes it seem like this cruel execution was saved for only the most special cases. Now here is the thing though, we don't know for sure if it actually happened. Many of the stories we hear about it come from Icelandic sagas, which were known to exaggerate events for dramatic effect. Historians once believed the blood eagle was real, but now some wonder if it's more myth than fact. Without physical proof like the remains of a skeleton showing signs of this torture, we may never know for sure. Well, whether it happened or not, the idea of the blood eagle says a lot about how far people were willing to go in the name of vengeance. But this wasn't the only time Vikings pushed limits. There were other moments when violence took an almost trance-like form and men reached states of pure rage. The wild mushroom that turned Vikings into warriors. Some say there was a kind of madness that took over Vikings which pushed them far beyond the limits of ordinary men. They didn't just fight with skill, they fought with unrelenting rage. Their enemies feared them not only for their weapons, but for the terrifying way they lost control.
There is only one reason to row with a weapon. That is to kill someone else on this boat. Your enemy is not here.
In old stories, this trance-like state was called berserkir. During these frenzies, warriors seemed almost possessed. They became wild, smashing everything in their path, caring little about their own lives or anyone else's. So what made them snap like that? One theory points to mushrooms. Specifically, a hallucinogenic mushroom called Amanita muscaria might have unlocked their violent fury. It's not just speculation, though evidence suggests that these mushrooms grew naturally in the region. Researchers believe that warriors likely ate them before battle, either as part of a ritual or perhaps unknowingly at first. If they took the mushrooms on purpose, the timing would have been crucial. The effects wouldn't hit right away. It's likely they planned things carefully, so the hallucinations and surge of energy would kick in just as they clashed with their enemies. Once under the influence, they would feel unstoppable, almost invincible. The chaotic behavior described in Norse sagas matches what we know about hallucinations, visions that blur reality and make you feel stronger than you really are. During these berserk fits, a fighter's heart would race and fear would melt away. With rage taking over, they fought harder, longer, and without mercy. To their enemies, it must have looked like they were battling demons instead of men. And once the battle was over, it's easy to imagine the toll it took, both on the warriors and those around them. Of course, this wasn't the only extreme thing the Vikings did. There is more to their survival tricks than strange plants. When it came to staying alive in brutal conditions, their methods got pretty creative and downright disgusting. The way they started fires. Starting a fire today is pretty easy. Just grab some matches or a lighter, and you are set. But the Vikings didn't have those things. They had to get creative, and some of their ideas were pretty strange. One fire-starting trick involved a mix of fungus and, well, something you would never think to use, urine. Instead of lighters, they used a special type of fungus called Touchwood, which grows on oak and beech trees. After gathering it, they had to beat and burn the fungus until it was thin and soft, almost like a piece of felt. But that's not even the weird part. To make it work better, they soaked the touchwood in human urine. The reason behind this gross-sounding step was actually quite smart. You see, urine has something called sodium nitrate in it, and this chemical would make the fungus smolder slowly instead of burning up right away. So, once it was soaked in the pee, the touchwood could hold a tiny bit of fire for a long time without just going out. It was like carrying a pocket-sized ember ready to spark into flames whenever it was needed. They could carry the smoldering touchwood with them wherever they went. If they needed to cook some meat or stay warm, all they had to do was use the smoldering fungus to start a fire. Sure, it wasn't as clean as striking a match, but it got the job done. It makes you wonder who figured out that boiling fungus in pee would make it so useful. Their fire-making might make you squirm, but it was just another way they found to survive in harsh conditions. And speaking of things that make you squirm, they had serious worm infestations. You might want to brace yourself because this is going to get a bit nasty before it gets truly strange. We are not talking about treasure hunts or lost cities here. This tale is all about ancient poop. Back in 2015, scientists at the University of Copenhagen found themselves sifting through a Viking latrine. While digging through old waste might not sound thrilling, the discoveries hidden in that muck turned out to be quite eye-opening. They found loads of parasite eggs, a sign that worm infestations were a huge problem. One scientist even called the find fascinating, though not everyone would agree. So why were these ancient people dealing with so many worms? Their eating habits had a lot to do with it. They often consumed raw or undercooked meat, especially organs like the liver and lungs. That risky diet made it all too easy for parasites to invade their bodies, settling in and causing constant trouble. But here's where it gets even stranger. The worms became such a problem that their bodies actually started to change to fight back. Over time, they developed a unique version of a molecule called alpha-1 antitrypsin, or A1AT for short. Back then, this special molecule helped them manage the inflammation and damage caused by all those pesky parasites. Fast forward to today though, and things aren't so helpful anymore. With fewer parasites around, that genetic twist isn't doing its old job. Instead, it's linked to health issues like emphysema and chronic lung problems. It seems those old defenses are now causing problems, as if the genes didn't know what to do without any worms to deal with. Their bodies adapted to survive, even if it led to some unexpected issues later on. But worms and parasites weren't the only things creeping around and causing problems. Spread of rats and mice. Ever wonder how rats and mice spread so far and wide across Europe? The answer might be hiding in the history of the Vikings. As these seafarers sailed from one place to another, they didn't just bring warriors and treasure, they also carried a few sneaky stowaways. Their wooden ships, loaded with supplies, became the perfect hideout for rats and mice. The food stored on board gave the little critters plenty to nibble on during long journeys. And the thick timber used to build the ships. That made cozy homes for them, where they could burrow and nest safely out of sight. So when the ships docked, it wasn't just the Vikings stepping onto new shores. Rats and mice scurried out, quickly settling in and multiplying wherever the ships landed. Historians believe this is why rat and mouse populations suddenly surged when these explorers toured Europe. The furry hitchhikers took full advantage of each stop, spreading wherever they went. It's even said that Vikings loved keeping cats, but with so many mice around, it was probably more of a practical choice than a fondness for furry friends. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.